Chapter 15 Among the Sandhills. Towards midnight, the boy yawned stiffly. "Core," he told Rags, "I ache right through. I've been layin' on a pile of chips." Rolling over, he crouched on all fours for a while before standing upright. "That's better," he added as he felt the numbness leave him. "Now I can move all right. You stay here until you hear me comin'." And to make sure, he slipped off his boots and stood them near. "They'll do as a marker," he thought, "and he won't shift away from 'em. Not that he would, but it's best to be careful." Barefooted, he crept toward the kitchen. After passing along the hedge, he reached the door without sound and gently pushed. Inside smelled familiar. For a moment nostalgic memories choked the boy. "It's been good," he thought, "comin' in every day and seeing Miss Jones there by the stove. You'd never get another one who'd see that you had the best." On bare, silent feet, he tiptoed to the pantry and tucked a loaf under his arm. From the sideboard, he pulled out the remnants of a joint. Careful-handed, he groped in a drawer until he found a small, freshly washed flour sack. Stuffing bread and meat in the sack together, he crept outside again. "I don't reckon," he told Rags when he reached the wood heap. "I've been gone 5 minutes. That's the best of knowing where everything is." Rags snuffled at the sack while the boy pulled on his boots. They felt cool again from their few short minutes of standing. At the trough, the boy pressed down the ball cock for a final drink. Afterwards, he rummaged underneath for the old dented billy, the one he'd used for gathering eggs. "I've had her there for days," he told Rags as he filled it. "It's all I could think of to carry a bit of water." With the full billy swinging in one hand and the sack in the other, he turned westward. Rags patted it into place close to the boy's heels. Close to the sandhill's edge, the boy glanced around in darkness. He could barely see Rags, though the young dog was close. "It's somewhere about here," the boy said, "that I buried your brothers and sisters. With a bit more light, I could tell the exact place." Plodding on for another stride or two, he felt a difference. The sand began to grit and slide under his boots. "It'll be all right," he thought, "when we get used to it. The thing is, we won't leave any tracks. Just keep on westward, and we must come out the other side." For guidance, he guessed at a course fixed on the low-hung stars. "I've been watching 'em for weeks," he panted jerkingly to Rags as they slithered and floundered up a steep sandy slope. "There's a string of 'em there, I know like me hand. They spread in a line dead above where the sun sets." But he forgot if he knew that the earth rotates. The stars change their fixing angles. On top of the slope he paused for breath and balanced the billy carefully. The water inside was slopping through the lid. He felt worried over the amount already lost. To save any more being wasted, he tore off a shirt sleeve and spread it across the opened billy. When he jammed on the lid, it made a tight fit. Part of the sleeve he tucked around the handle. "That's it," he told Rags. "Now we're all safe and set. The lid won't leak if it gets bumped about, and the rag'll save me hand." Partly sliding on his behind, he began to descend. Rags plugged by his side, paw deep in the gritty sand. At the bottom, the sand leveled off for several yards, then steepened to another hillock. Beyond it, in the darkness, stretched another and another, mile after cresting mile of them. The boy lost count of how many he and Rags floundered up and down in the next few hours. He only knew that every slope dragged tightly on his leg muscles. The sack and billy made his arm joints ache until he could barely use them. In a deep, dark hollow, he suddenly flopped to his knees. Rolling over onto his back, he stared up at the star-covered sky. "I don't know," he mumbled as Rags tumbled beside him, "how we'll go. You wouldn't think it'd take so much out of you." To moisten his lips, he sucked on the damp shirt-sleeve. Rags licked the cool billy lid. Both thought longingly of the wet, clear water inside. Toward early light, when night seems to deepen, the boy scrambled upright. "Come on," he told Rags. "We got to push on. There's a long way yet to the other side." The words expressed what he'd been thinking over. Where was the other side, and how far was it? He only had the hearsay word of Ted and Ross. Even Yabba hadn't known where the sandhills came to an end, and he ought to know, the boy thought. He's traveled more parts than most, yet now I'm in, I've got to keep going. It'd be just as hard to find me way back. Depressed by the darkness and the tired slithering struggle up one hill, only to find that another lay beyond, he stooped for a moment to smooth Rags' ears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "that I brought you into it. I thought I was right," but he shrugged as he straightened again. "You don't know. You get pushed by everything and don't really think." With the billy in one hand and the sack in the other, he took a short step, then groaned. The boots on his feet had stiffened, and the sand gritted his raw toes. They felt oozy with what he guessed was blood. He had to hobble slowly before he became used to the feel. "You wouldn't believe," he muttered to Rags, as they floundered and struggled across the next slope, "how they hurt. It's like a red-hot fire in me boots. I can feel the skin peelin'." Though he had his ears pricked, Rags barely heard a word. The crunch of sand drowned most other sounds. Close to the top, the boy felt a vine brush his trousers. Frightened for a moment as a hard, twisty tendril curled around his leg, he jumped sideways. Rags sprang after him. The two collided as the boy gasped, "Whew! I thought it was a snake." Then in front of their startled eyes, a great looming shape snarled up from the sand. Boy, dog, Billy, and sack all scattered headlong as a wild, equally startled beast pounded over them. In a panic of fear, the crazed animal wheeled, skidding around on the sand, and charged back again. It was a camel, leggy and humpbacked. The boy smelled its rank, bitter odor before he huddled over quickly. He sighed when the brute missed his head by inches. For long minutes he stayed crouched, listening to Rags snarling somewhere out in the darkness. Presently the young dog came back, his paws dragged tiredly, sloughing through the sand. Choked by his own thumping heart, the boy sat up. "Corey," managed to gasp, then suddenly remembered the billy. Groping around on hands and knees, he searched until he heard Rags licking thirstily. Crawling toward him, the boy felt where the dog licked. The billy was flattened, stamped on by the camel. Rags was licking at the sand where the cool fresh water had seeped. Unable to believe, the boy dug his fingers in the wetness. "You ain't," he started to say, and couldn't say any more. His tongue clove chokingly to the roof of his mouth. He could feel his eyes were filling. Why, he thought, did it have to happen? There's all these sandhills, and we stumble on a camel. One lonely camel sleepin' on his own. Now we're sunk. We ain't got a chance, whatever happens." For long, lonely minutes he sat hunched in the darkness. Though Rags crept close, the boy felt a greater need. He needed someone human, someone to help and guide. And he remembered Miss Jones standing quietly in the kitchen, her large white hands fussing over the table. Kanga, too, leaning gaunt-faced in the shed doorway, with the setting sun behind him. Thought of Kanga made the boy glance toward the horizon. A faint gray tinge smudged beyond the sandhills. Old Kanga would be creaking over on his bunk, then stalking stiffly down to the bunkhouse steps. The boy almost heard the footsteps. He imagined listening for Kanga as the old man passed his room. Hazy with thoughts, the boy looked around surprisedly. When he noticed the light had improved on the crest where he sat, he could see down the next slope and across to another. The hollow between was covered with coarse, prickly vines. "So that's it," he found enough voice to whisper. "We stumbled on a feeding place. To make it worse, we bumped into the only camel." And suddenly he laughed and cried together, scuffing the tears on his arm. He felt ashamed when Rags nudged inquiringly against his chest. "Yeah," the boy added, "and I was thinking about others instead of you. But I'm better now, mate, and we'll push on." Hobbling up, he gathered the sack and pulled the sleeve from the crushed billy. Awkward-handed, he bound the cloth around his head in turban fashion. The cuff kept slipping, and he let it hang over one eye. Finally ready, he hobbled on, with Rags slithering close behind. In the gaining light, they were able to see more clearly. The boy tried to angle their route more up each succeeding slope, but after a time he realized it was throwing him off course. The rising sun proved it by his changing shadow. "It ain't no use," he panted, as they paused on a crest. "You can't do it easy. It only makes a zigzag, and you finish up nowhere. We've got to go straight up 'em." Thankful for a breather, he flopped on his behind to begin the slide downwards. Rags slid in the groove gouged by the boy's trousers. As the sun climbed higher, so each dune seemed to grow taller, while the boy sweated gaspingly from the heat searing down his back. Rags slobbered closer to the red-hot sand. His tongue began to swell, and the boy tore off his other sleeve to bind around the dog's neck. Whether it helped or not, he wasn't able to know. His own tongue felt as if it were growing. He could feel it push bloatedly against the backs of his teeth. Dazed and almost choked, he paused time after time to rest. Each time he did, he stared miserably at the frantic, strained look of Rag's eyes. The young dog was failing. "There ain't nothin' the boy thought I can do, not even go back. We can't make it either way." Stunned by the heat from sand and sun, he began to stagger at every fresh effort. He wanted to stay sitting hunched in the sun, but the next slope drew him on. You never know, his mind told him, what's on the other side. There might be water or anything, and as the boy struggled, so Rags followed. He had always done so, wherever the end. Close to noon, after a crawling hands and knees climb, the boy looked downwards. Unable for a moment to believe his sun-bleared eyes, he stared disbelievingly. Down in the next hollow stood a lone, withered desert tree. Not a leaf hung on its peeled, straggly branches, but there was shade at the trunk's base, a tiny smudge of it because of the high sun. Sliding and rolling, he dragged Rags with him until they were both covered by the shadow. In the small relief from the glare, he rested his shoulders on the trunk and closed his eyes. "Cor," he parted cracked lips to croak. "We're out o' the sun. We're out of it, Rags, and can have a little spell." Dazed, numbed, and shocked, he fell asleep. Rags sprawled on his lap, stunned from heat exhaustion. The heat of noon wiped away all shade as Kanga topped a nearby sandhill. His bloodshot eyes, raw from searching since dawn, saw boy and dog stretched tiredly in the sun. Their slack, dry mouths hung open as the old dogman rode close and swung from his saddle. The leather creaked, but neither boy nor dog heard. Stiff in a slow, sure way, old Kanga leaned until his shadow fell across them. "They ain't hurtin'," he thought, "and the rest'll do 'em good. They'll wake when they feel they're chokin'." With one great hand propping him on the tree, he leaned for a long time before the boy stirred. As his head rolled around, he opened one eye. His mouth gaped more before he could croak. "Kanga, Cor, it's Kanga." He closed his eyes again to make sure. When he opened them slowly, afraid of what he might not see, he sighed. The old dogman was real and standing by his horse while he unbuckled a water bag. Rags had both eyes open, watching Kanga's hands. Unhurriedly, Kanga pulled the cork from its nozzle and tipped the bag to his mouth. His gaunt, lined cheeks bulged when he bent over, then blew a fine, thin spray of water over the boy's mouth and face. "Let it lay," Kanga said as he straightened, "and soak. Just turn your head from the sun." Still slow in his movements, he did the same for Rags. The young dog's tongue licked frantically as the water sprayed over its face. Almost as frantic, the boy felt he wanted to snatch the dripping bag, but he couldn't make the effort. Kanga's eyes and manner kept him stretched against the tree trunk. His legs stayed still, resting on hot, sun-scorched sand. After several choking minutes, Kanga repeated the spraying. Then, when he judged the time was right, slopped a splash of water on the boy's mouth and tipped some between Rag's gaping jaws. "Now you're set," Kanga said, and recorked the water bag. In a few more minutes, You can have a swaller, then we'll be on our way. There's a fair bit of sand to cover." While he spoke, his horse nickered softly. The sound echoed, dulled by the surrounding sandhills. With a papery piece of bark from a tree, Kanga cleaned the animal's nostrils. Groping and unsure, the boy dragged himself upright. "I'm right," he managed to say. "If you'll let me have that swaller, me tongue's coming back to normal." Kanga nodded without speaking and let the boy drink a great mouthful. Afterwards, the old man dished in his hat to slot water in for Rags. Under the fierce flaring sun, boy and dog began to revive, though the boy still hobbled. "It's me feet," he told Kanga. "The sand got inside me boots and skinned 'em." Kanga shook the hat free of dust and rammed it on his head. He strapped the water bag to his saddle before he said, "Yeah, it would at that. There ain't much sense, son, in what you did, whichever way you look at it." The boy half turned ashamedly. "I don't know," he said. "You were close to taking Rags, and I had to do something. I didn't reckon," he added, "that it'd be so tough. We had bad luck when we lost our water." To avoid looking at Kanga, he leaned against the trunk and closed his eyes. His eyeballs felt hot when he pressed them on his arm. Rags crept near to the tree to be in the boy's shadow. For long, quiet moments, Kanga neither moved nor spoke. The big bay horse dozed behind him. Around and beyond rolled the undulating sandhills, acre upon acre of tortured barren waste. On their slopes shimmered the dancing heat waves. As if in a mirage, Kanga saw his life for what it had been and what it would be: sun, dust, and loneliness. The endless search across a wide, dusty land that accomplished nothing. Yet there ain't no way, he thought, to break it. A man couldn't live any other. I'd miss me dogs and the trust of old Skipper. When he goes, I can take me turn when it comes. Turning slowly, he gathered the bridle reins. "Luck or not," he said, "you nearly died, and there's a lot of life ahead of you. You don't want to throw it away." The boy shivered. Kanga's words reminded him of the hopelessness he'd felt, the tears he couldn't hold back at the feel of the flattened, empty Billy. Yet he wanted above all else, even his life, to keep Rags. "You can talk and talk," he thought, "but it don't change nothing. He's all I've got to hang on to." Suddenly he knew he was wrong. Kanga wanted the pup as much as he did. Maybe more. Kanga's gaunt, lined face never showed his true feelings. His words never did either. Pushing away from the trunk, the boy dabbed his cracked lips. "Yeah," he whispered under his covering hand. "I've been wrong, Kanga, and I'm sorry I caused you any trouble. I'll be glad any time you want to take Rags." As he whispered, he looked down. It seemed to him he was saying goodbye. Kanga rubbed the bay's neck. "If you've finished," he said, "we'll get on. Like I said, there's a long way yet to travel. And as for the pup," he swung up into the saddle, "you can keep him. I reckon that somehow he's really yours." Tall on the big bay's back, he kicked a foot free of a stirrup. The iron glittered for a moment, swinging in that sun. The boy stared, open-mouthed, sun cracks forgotten. You mean," he finally managed to say, "that you don't want him? You ain't going to make him a king dog?" Kanga shook his head. "No," he said shortly. "Now climb up here. You can see by the sun. We ain't got much of the day. We'll have to do it slow, carrying double." The boy reached for the stirrup, then paused. A sense of possessing something alive, and his very own, welled in him. He looked up questioningly before he asked, "How about Rags?" Though his tongue's gone down, he's still pretty tired. "A good dog uses his own legs," Kanga said, but sight of the boy's face made him add, bring him up here. He can ride in the middle. Now get a hand on me belt and haul." With Rags under one arm and a foot in the stirrup, the boy did as Kanga had said. He was halfway up when Kanga's hard, gnarled hand came down to haul him the rest of the way. Straddled behind Kanga on the bay's lean rump, he dangled his aching feet. Rags balanced in between him and the old dogman's back. The three rode close together, swaying to the big bay's gate. On the long ride home, Kanga guided the horse unerringly up the slithery, sliding slopes, down across choking, heat-filled hollows. He followed a course seen only by desert-trained eyes, the drift and lay of sand from prevailing winds, and the weather-molded peaks of the ridges. Always the sun stayed behind, flaring on their backs. The boy dozed, clinging to Kanga's belt. Rags sheltered between them, shaded from the glare. The bay horse floundered to reach every crest, then skidded on its hocks to descend into the hollows. Toward late afternoon, Kanga shaded his eyes. He could see Ross and an aboriginal riding toward him on a far-off crest. Another pair of riders topped a ridge. Still keeping to his course, Kanga gradually met Ross and the aboriginal, Charlie, on the peak of a long sloping hill. Their horses labored together until they stood head to sweaty head. Charlie's face split happily in a smile as Ross said, "So you found him. Is he right, or is there something we can do?" He tipped back his hat while he spoke. Deep worry lines grooved his face. He rubbed with his hand to ease them. "Yeah," Kanga nodded. "I found 'em all right. They was under an old needlewood. Just follow behind in case me horse gives out." And he nudged the animal's ribs. As it floundered on again, the boy looked up. His head felt dizzy for a moment, but cleared when he shook it. "Aye, Charlie," he mumbled, "and you, Mr. Ross, I dunno much what to say." Ross urged his horse close to the big bay's rump and leaned forward. "Then don't say anything," he said. "There's plenty of time to talk. Just leave it that I'm glad we found you." "Me too," Charlie added, jogging up beside Ross. "We all glad. Mrs. Jones going to be happy." Then the two allowed their horses to ease their pace. The bay floundered on in the lead alone. On its swaying rump, the boy helped balance Rags and thought about Miss Jones. He wondered what she would say when he went into the kitchen, and behind the thought was another. He wished she would stay for a long time yet on Yambura. "You never know," he muttered, half aloud to himself. "She might. You can always change in anything." If Kanga heard, he rode on unheeding. The wide square set of his back remained unchanging. It was almost dark when the big bay slid down the last sandhill. Close to the homestead, Kanga reined in near the great water trough. Ross and the rest of the gathered search party jogged past, on their way to the horse yards. Their tired horses nickered at sight of the familiar watering place, but their riders urged them on. "Cool 'em off first," the boy heard Ross say, then add, as if remembering, "Get some shut-eye, son. You'll be right in the morning." The men jogging around him nodded in agreement. Some called, "See you later, son," while others just raised their dusty hands and said, "Good night," or "See you around." They all sounded pleased to know the boy was home, found safe and well. He tried to call or reply, but his throat was too dry. The call was little more than a croak. You'd reckon, he thought as he scrambled down from the bay, they'd be mad. Yet they ain't. It shows you how they really are. On the ground, his legs doubled under him. He felt Kanga's hard, steadying hand grip his shoulder. "Get the feel first," the old dogman said, "before you move. Them feet of yours need cleaning." Rags jumped while Kanga was speaking and landed near the trough. "Thanks," the boy said. "Thanks, Kanga. I'll soak 'em, boots and all. You're sure," he went on, listening to Rags lap thirstily, "that you don't want to change? I mean, you know, you can if you like. Me and you have always been sort of mates." He said the word slowly, pausing to lick his dry, cracked lips. The sounds from the trough made him long for a deep, cool drink, yet he wanted to stay talking to Kanga, the gaunt, weathered old man seemed somehow closer than he had ever been. His voice had a gentler tone. Kanga gathered the reins and peered beyond the boy to Rags. In the darkening light, the young dog was standing upright. His forepaws rested on the trough. To Kanga's discerning eyes, Rags was all he had hoped for. A fine, strong dog fit to be king of any pack. Yet he won't be, Kanga thought. His voice gruffened as he said, "No, he's yours, son. Nothing will change that." And he nudged the bay's sweaty ribs. Its tired, strained legs responded and carried Kanga toward the horse yards. Dust muffled the slow, shuffling hoofbeats. For quiet, still moments the boy stood listening. He wished there was more he could say to Kanga, some way to thank him, but there ain't, he thought. Words ain't much, whichever way you use them, and they couldn't pay. For Rags, stiff on his raw, blistered feet, he hobbled to the ballcock. Under its green, mossy valve, he drank great mouthfuls that hurt his throat and made his chest ache. Afterwards he looked around for Rags. The young dog was near, sprawled close to his feet. As if understanding, Rags straightened quickly. His claws scrabbled beside the boy, as the two scrambled awkwardly into the trough. Side by side, on the trough's end, they watched the boy's boots soak. They looked dark under the smooth, shadowy water. When the packed, gritty sand inside loosened, he eased them off, then dumped them over the side. They squelched soggily as they landed. "That's them," the boy said. He put an arm around Rags. "You know," he added, "I feel tired right out, but I reckon it was worth it." Author's note: this story is set in the vast, sparsely populated center of Australia at the time of the early 1930s. Conditions there today are much as they were then, with allowance perhaps for more and better traveling by airplanes. Otherwise, the life and work are of necessity much the same. Across this enormous stretch of inland country lies a string of great cattle stations. As Australian ranches are called, they reach from the far west of New South Wales to the Northern Territory and the desert edges of South Australia. Yambura is an imaginary station near the desert. The cattle stations usually have from 10 to 30,000 cattle on them. The bullocks are bred and reared until 3 or 4 years old. Then they are driven off to the railheads, often hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles away for trucking down to Sydney, Melbourne, or Adelaide. There they are sold and trucked away again to pastures more suited to fattening cattle. To work these great stations, hundreds of horses are needed. Most of them are half wild and range freely when not being used, but while they are in work, the horses are kept in a paddock of several thousand acres. Usually 60 or 70 horses are in work at one time, according to the size of the station. Each night a horse called a night horse is shut in the yards for a stockman to use in the early morning to bring in the work horses. The stockmen select their horses for the day, then the remainder are turned out again until the following morning. For the period a horse is in work, he may be ridden only once or twice a week, yet still loose condition because of the heat and the arduous work. He usually has to cover great distances carrying a heavy stock saddle and rider. Most stockmen seem to be big men. At the end of the work period, the whole mob is turned out on distant country for a long spell and a fresh batch is brought in. Horses are essential to a cattle station. Without them, the cattle could not be handled. Very occasionally, special horses, imported stallions, or selected hacks such as Powder and Patches, who were real Arab horses, may be kept in stables. Many of the stockmen on the cattle stations are aborigines, usually working happily alongside their white counterparts, or under overseers like Ross. When they are not working, they live much as their forefathers did, and go walk about when the mood takes them. Others on the move are the swagmen, men with their blanket rolls or swags on the tramp from job to job, who travel along the seemingly endless dusty miles of horses and car tracks. and wild horses, donkeys, and in some parts camels roam over the whole area. Dogmen like Kanga are employed to eradicate wild dogs, dingoes, and rabbits. They dig out the warrens, burn hollow logs that are being used as lairs, and use their dog packs to kill all surfacing animals. These men take great pride in their ability to train and control dogs. Of necessity, they live dour, lonely lives, always with their animals. Each cattle station then, as now, has a boss who is either the owner or a manager. Then there is an overseer, and also numerous stockmen, odd job men, and general roustabouts. Also a cook like Miss Jones, and other women to help in the homestead, usually aboriginal maidservants. At the lower end of the scale is a boy called a wood and water joey. His job is to cut wood for the kitchen stove, clean watering troughs, and do many other odd jobs, such as helping with the killing of animals. All meat eaten is killed on the station, and some stations graze a flock of killing sheep to add variety to an otherwise continuous diet of beef. This happened at Yambura in the story. Isolation still makes each great cattle station a world in itself. The homestead is the center, and more often than not the cook is the center of the homestead, ruling with all the power that a lone woman has amongst many lonely men. Most of the incidents in this story actually happened, though perhaps not in the same order. The characters, too, are based on real people, although their names are invented. And last of all, both the boy and the dog seem very real to me. I hope they do to everyone else.